Imagine Europe at the dawn of the 18th century, kingdoms trembling, thrones contested, and entire empires calculating their every move like pieces on a colossal chessboard. The death of the Spanish King Charles II in 1700 left behind not just an empty throne, but the spark for one of the most devastating conflicts in European history. The War of the Spanish Succession. This was not just a dynastic squabble. It was a struggle that would decide the balance of power across the continent, involving nearly every major European nation, from France and Spain to Britain, Austria, and the Dutch Republic. Historian John Lynn, in the Wars of Louis XIV, 1667 a 1714, described it as the defining conflict that determined whether Europe would be dominated by Bourbon France or tempered by a balance of rival powers. And today, we are going to journey deep into this war of alliances, betrayals, colossal battles, and the figures whose decisions altered the very shape of Europe. So, before we march into this battlefield of kings, muskets, and cavalry charges, let me ask you, do you love history that feels alive, full of drama, strategy, and power? Then don't just watch and list. Subscribe right now to the channel, because here we bring the past back to life, turning names and dates into vivid stories of ambition and glory. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Because the War of the Spanish Succession is not just about kings and generals, it is about how modern Europe itself was forged. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, erupted from one of the greatest crises of royal succession in European history, when Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king of Spain, died childless in November 1700. He left behind a kingdom weakened by centuries of dynastic mismanagement, yet still commanding a vast empire stretching across the Americas, the Philippines, parts of Italy, and the Low Countries. The Spanish throne was no ordinary, it was a global empire's crown. In his will, Charles named Philip of Anjou, grandson of the French king Louis XIV, as his heir. This seemed like a straightforward succession, but in the geopolitical climate of the time, it was explosive. If Philip inherited Spain, France and Spain would unite under the Bourbon dynasty, creating an overwhelming block of power that threatened the balance of Europe. The fear of a Franco-Spanish superpower sent shockwaves through rival courts: Britain, the Dutch Republic, and Austria, all wary of France's growing hegemony under Louis XIV, formed the Grand Alliance. As historian Derek Mackay argues, in The Rise of the Great Powers, 1648 a 1815, the succession crisis was less about Spain itself than about the fear of Bourbon universal monarchy. And indeed, the war that followed was not confined to the Iberian Peninsula. It stretched from Flanders to Italy, from the German states to the New World, making it one of the first truly global conflicts. The early years of the war were marked by swift maneuvers and political uncertainty. Louis XIV, the Sun King, quickly declared that his grandson would accept Charles II's will, consolidating Bourbon claims over Spain. To counter this, the Grand Alliance backed Archduke Charles of Austria, a Habsburg claimant, as the rightful king of Spain. Europe was thus split: Bourbon Spain on one side, Habsburg Spain on the other. This division turned the Iberian Peninsula into a central stage, while battles also raged in the Low Countries, the Rhine, and even colonial theaters such as North America, where the conflict was known as Queen Anne's War. One of the most decisive figures in the war was John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, who rose to prominence as one of Britain's greatest military commanders. Alongside him stood Prince Eugene of Savoy, the brilliant Austrian general. Together, they orchestrated a series of campaigns that struck at the very heart of French power. Their partnership has often been described as one of the greatest in military history. Historian Winston Churchill himself, a descendant of Marlborough and Marlborough, his life and times that never before or since have two generals so perfectly complemented each other in courage, vision, and genius. The Battle of Blenheim in 1704 stands out as a pivotal moment. Marlborough and Eugene coordinated a daring assault on French and Bavarian forces along the Danube, preventing them from threatening Vienna and knocking Bavaria out of the war. The battle was a crushing defeat for Louis XIV, shattering the myth of French invincibility. The historian John A. Lynn noted that Blenheim redefined Europe's perception of France, proving that the Sun King's armies were not unbeatable. The victory electrified the Grand Alliance, boosted morale, and secured Marlborough's reputation as one of history's greatest generals. But Blenheim was only the beginning. The campaigns that followed Ramillies in 1706, Haudenarde in 1708, and Malplaquet in 1709 continued to demonstrate the effectiveness of Allied strategy. Each victory pushed France further onto the defensive, straining its resources and morale. At Malplaquet, however, the cost was staggering. Though Marlborough and Eugene won the field, the Allies suffered appalling casualties, leading some to question whether the war was worth its price. As historian David Chandler observed in The Art of Warfare in the Age of Marlborough, the victories of the Alliance bled them white, for every step forward came at terrible human cost. Meanwhile, the political tides shifted. In Britain, war weariness grew as the cost of funding campaigns mounted. The Tories, rising in influence, questioned the endless bloodshed for continental gains. In Spain itself, the conflict was bitter and prolonged. Philip V, as he became known, managed to rally Spanish support in his favor, particularly in Castile, ensuring that his claim did not collapse despite Allied victories elsewhere. The war's global dimension also cannot be overlooked. In North America, British and French colonists clashed in Queen Anne's War, fighting over control of frontier territories. In the Caribbean, naval battles sought to disrupt colonial trade and supply lines. The war was also felt in the Indian Ocean, where European trading companies skirmished for supremacy. For the first time, European dynastic disputes were producing ripple effects across multiple continents, foreshadowing the global conflicts of the 18th century. By 1711, exhaustion was setting in on all sides. France was drained, Britain was politically divided, and Austria faced internal challenges. Then came a dramatic twist. Emperor Joseph I of Austria died, leaving Archduke Charles as heir to the Austrian throne. If Charles were to succeed in becoming King of Spain as well, the Habsburgs would control both Austria and Spain, precisely the kind of continental dominance the Allies had claimed to fear from the Bourbons. This sudden shift made Britain and the Dutch rethink their objectives. The idea of preventing Bourbon hegemony could not be replaced with the creation of a Habsburg superpower. Negotiations accelerated, leading to the Treaty of Utrecht. In 1713, the treaty represented a monumental redrawing of the European map. Philip V was recognized as King of Spain, but he had to renounce any claim to the French throne, ensuring that France and Spain would never be united under a single monarch. Britain emerged as one of the biggest winners, gaining Gibraltar and expanding its Mediterranean presence and securing vital trade rights, including the lucrative Jacinto, the contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. France made territorial concessions, but preserved its core strength. The Dutch secured buffer territories, though their relative power would begin to wane in the decades ahead. The Habsburgs, meanwhile, gained control over the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia, cementing their influence in Italy. The Treaty of Reshaped, in 1714, finalized peace between France and Austria, officially concluding the war. Europe had been reshaped. No single power dominated, and the concept of a balance of power became the guiding principle of European diplomacy for the next century. The war marked a turning point in military history as well. The age of the musket and bayonet, the rise of professional standing armies, and the increasing importance of logistics and finance in sustaining prolonged campaigns. In the end, the War of the Spanish Succession was a conflict that defined the early modern era. It was not just about crowns and thrones, but about the emergence of a new Europe, where no single empire could dominate unchecked. For admirers of military history, it is a war rich in strategy, innovation, and larger-than-life personality. Eugene, Louis XIV, Philip V, whose decisions reverberated for generations. And so, as we look back at this monumental struggle, we must ask, what does it mean when wars are fought? Not just for land, but for the balance of an entire world order. The War of the Spanish Succession reminds us that history is never just about kings, and treaties. It is about the battles that forged the destiny of nations and the sacrifices of those who fought in fields far from home. If you've made it this far, you are one of those rare souls who doesn't just consume history, but lives it. So I ask you, join us, subscribe, share this story, and bring others into the ranks, because together we can keep the fire of history burning bright. The War of the Spanish Succession ended more than 3 centuries ago, but its lessons about power, ambition, and the price of glory still echo today. This was not just a war, it was the moment Europe decided its future.